Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Lindgren with MassBio. Thanks for joining us for this critical topic. I'd like to thank our speakers for their generosity. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. Just click on it, and then you'll be able to type in a question. The chat is also available to you, but please use the Q&A for questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Pothier of Kpmg.
Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. It's great to virtually see everybody out there in the world of MassBio and to welcome my panelists here for us today. As we go through this world of COVID and as we look every day, we can't go 1 minute in CNN without talking about testing and talking about COVID testing overall and how challenging it is and who has capacity and who doesn't have capacity, and how to make a program work, and how to keep people safe, and how to reopen schools and keep them open. And I think all of us who are sector leaders, parents, medical institution leaders, anybody that's in this space is constantly racking their brains for how to do it right. And so today, what we are going to do is spend a little bit of time with people in the space that are working through it, front lines, front runners in the space, that are working on it and working on it from very different angles. From a Kpmg perspective, where I spend my time, it is really working on thinking about the implementation of these plans, working through these plans in different ways. From all of the other groups that we have here on the line today, we're looking at different lenses, from a medical institution lens, from an innovator lens, from an aggregator lens. And as I introduce each one of the panelists, I will spend a couple of seconds talking about what each role each one of them plays, and then later as they introduce themselves, they'll be able to tell their stories, their challenges, and what goes on moving forward. So without further ado, what I would like to do today is introduce my panel. So I'm going to start with Rahul Dhanda, and he is the co-founder and CEO of Sherlock Biosciences. He has been in this space for over 20 years, innovating on this front, first at T2 and now here, and really will spend the time talking through how innovation in the age of COVID has to go quicker, it has to be more efficient, it has to be more effective, and there's a lot more at stake. And so he'll spend some time talking about that. Sek is next, and he is our co-founder and CEO of Verve Therapeutics. And we call him the local aggregator. He has spent time really working with local biotech companies and institutions to put together testing programs. He'll spend some time talking about the testing program today. He'll spend some time working through some of the challenges and walking through it overall. Glenn Miller is next. Glenn is our market sector leader at Mass General Brigham Innovation Office, and he is our health systems master. When we think about how a health system deals with this space, and as we look at all of the different pieces of not only testing, but how to get testing to different people, how to report out testing results, what a health system thinks about, and honestly, what Mass General Brigham thinks about as an overall entity, not only from a local perspective, but from a national and an international perspective. Greg Welch is here with us from the Broad. He's our human resources director, and he's our people person. When you look at the ramifications of COVID, getting people back to work when they are safely in their homes, whether they be in their homes filled with books or in a galaxy far, far away like I am right now, really working through how we innovate and mobilize our people, how we get people to work through testing and otherwise, and what challenges that we've seen even in an institution like the Broad that has so much well covered. And then finally, Jessica Lin, who is my fellow leader at Kpmg, who puts together our implementation programs and planning with all of the different aggregators in the space. And we really call her the orchestrator, because at the end of the day, when we look at what we do at Kpmg, we take all of the different innovators and health systems and sports franchises and whoever we happen to be working with and put them together to implement testing that makes sense, that is safe, and keeps people safe. So that is our panel, and I'm very lucky to have this crew here with me today to not only answer my questions, but also to answer your questions in the audience. So as Chris from MassBio mentioned before, please use your Q&A button to write in your questions as we're going through this. I will take this opportunity now, though, to have each panelist go through how they're working through COVID testing and their point of view on what they're doing well, the challenges that exist, and what their new frontier is. Each one of them will do 5 minutes. Then I'll do some general questions, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A that I see is coming in. All right? So we're going to start with our innovator, with Raul. So if you could spend some time, first talk about Sherlock, talk about what you're doing in COVID, and work through that process with us, and then we'll bounce around as we see fit.
Great, thanks Kristen, and thanks to MassBio for having me. I'm very excited to speak to this group. So Sherlock Biosciences is, we're an engineering biology company, which means that we're using very specific tools to develop diagnostic tests for various markets. Specifically, in the COVID space, we're deploying a CRISPR platform we call Sherlock and a synthetic biology platform we call Inspector to address the pandemic. And the way that we have structured our approach to this has really been focused on what we consider sort of the 3 areas of need that we expected to progress if the pandemic continued from when we first identified it as something we need to really create solutions for and innovate around back in January. So the first approach we took is using our CRISPR platform to develop a kit that could be used in high volume hospital labs. And that got EUA approval middle of the year and has been launched so that we can help address what I think was the first wave of demand and need, which was how does one provide high volume tests where these patients who were being grouped and directed towards testing based on symptomology, highly symptomatic, which meant they're going to hospitals, and we're placing a lot of these patients in hospitals, and reference labs and central lab testing was where we needed more capacity. And so that was where we began. I think as we had hoped it wouldn't progress beyond that, but as we saw the pandemic did, we felt that the next area was really to develop point of care tests that could be used in the pharmacy and the primary care physician in locations where we wouldn't aggregate so many symptomatic patients and increase the probabilities of spread, but actually gave a little bit more freedom to those individuals who want to be tested to go to decentralized settings. And so we've struck a deal with a company called Binks Healthcare a few months back, where we're placing our CRISPR technology onto their system, which is cartridge-based, rapid, 20 to 25 minute turnaround time, but also something that's under CLIA waiver so that it could be used in outside of the healthcare system, outside of hospitals per se. And I think that's going to have and should have a fairly big impact because there hasn't been a lot of point of care solutions that have developed, and there's clearly the need. And after that, where we feel that there is a need is empowering individuals to actually get results in self-testing locations. And that, the most obvious of those areas is the home, but also in locales like assisted living or even schools. And, as Kpmg has been working on strategies to even do it in stadiums where one can get the result in a very short amount of time without an instrument, without a technician, but something that could be self-administered at a cost point that it could be done serially if necessary, but also by oneself with a high enough accuracy to make decisions around and make decisions as to whether you even leave the house. And so that's the third program we have in development, and I think that satisfies what is becoming a clear need and probably the most germane to this particular group as we have this conversation around how do we reopen. Just at a high level to address Kristen's questions around where are we seeing challenges, where are we seeing opportunities. The challenges, in a lot of ways, if we think about how we can solve molecular diagnostic testing and making it more broadly accessible, fall into a couple of categories for me. Some are in supply chain. How do we have the access to reagents and the kinds of solutions we need to just make testing broadly available. Some are in managing demand. How do we actually have personnel who are available to run all these tests so that we can actually get results? And then some are actually, and then beyond that, the infrastructure and implementation. How do we get results to people in a fast enough time frame that there isn't a lapse between when that sample is taken and when they actually enter into some broader social group? I think there's a spectrum of challenges there. And then I think there's also a technology challenge, which is if we want to address this and address it across a whole series of, this continuum of where the needs are, there is a need for innovation. We've had a lot of the tools for diagnostics for 30 to 80 years, depending upon which technology we're using, whether it's antigen, antibody, or molecular. And we've tried to solve the decentralized high accuracy and rapid turnaround for that duration, and have succeeded in a lot of ways, and just haven't taken it as far in others. And so, where I also feel we need help is, investing in driving more innovation beyond just the innovation stage, because I think there's a misunderstanding about what it means to be innovating in this space. Technology is one aspect of it, but scaling, manufacturing, distribution, these are other aspects of it, which represent risk to earlier stage companies that could be addressed by buying down that risk with capital. And so there's a continuum here where there's a very fertile ground for the pandemic, but also broadly in how diagnostics is going to fit in with healthcare broadly. And I think finally, it's this question of diagnostics and testing is one part of a whole, but there has to be a systematic whole that this fits into, where what we're providing is information that helps us manage risk. And it's not just having a test. The test is not the solution, but what it does provide is data to help us manage that risk. And I think as we build infrastructure and systems around that, we can holistically approach this. And then we've got a template, not just for pandemics, but for healthcare broadly.
Fantastic. Thank you. And it's a perfect segue into, when you think about the innovation challenge, what you wrapped up with is it's a whole systems approach. And so Glenn, as we think about this from a Mass General Brigham perspective, as we think about it from a regional, national, international perspective, what are you seeing when you look at your point of view in this space? How are you seeing a little bit of differences on the innovative side, the same kind of things? Tell us about your experience.
Well, thanks, Kristen, and thanks to MassBio for setting this entire panel up. We really look at it in a number of different ways. One, from the system side, as you said, Kristen, the laboratories within the hospitals are busier than they've ever been, even at the height of the pandemic here in Massachusetts in the mid-April timeframe. A lot of that is because the hospitals are open and functioning again, so they're doing their normal workload plus the COVID workload and looking at asymptomatics. What we're seeing along with that is, with the improvements in a therapeutic approach, people are doing better when they're in the hospital. We have many fewer patients in the hospital now than we have, certainly at the height. And the vaccine trials are underway in many of our institutions. The problem that happens on the diagnostic side is that supporting all that creates enormous supply chain problems. And it varies from the ability to send out samples to not knowing whether or not consumables, plates, tubes, pipette tips, those sort of things are going to be available. And in many cases, the laboratories are not knowing how many samples they're able to do until about 9 o'clock in the morning on any given day. So it makes it very difficult to plan for future capacity and how we're going to be able to do testing even within our own system. And it's been a struggle now for a long time. It started with PPE, and now it's continuing on to diagnostic testing in that. On the community side, we're seeing challenges again with how we manage patients coming back into our community healthcare centers and funneling into the main hospitals. At the height of the pandemic, there were maybe a dozen people getting put in ambulances every day sent into the hospitals, and now that's gone away. But now people are coming back in with things that they put off because they didn't want to go to our community centers. And how does that flow of patients coming into our clinics, which has to be a unidirectional flow, be managed when you don't have point of service testing that can get back in a relevant time frame. In the broader community, we're seeing in underserved communities in places like New Bedford, Mass, in the fish processing industry, where the turnaround time for many of their tests may be upwards of 10 to 14 days, which makes the test essentially useless. In any given day, the estimate is that about half of the testing capacity in the city of Boston goes unused, mainly because it's much easier to move a patient from one ICU to another between hospitals than it is to move one sample from a lab to another, because the LIMS systems, the information systems, don't talk to one another. So it's a real challenge trying to build capacity, understanding what the capacity is, because people didn't share that kind of capacity load on a routine basis prior to the pandemic. And then trying to predict, where do you send a block of samples and how fast can those samples be done? And then when the pandemic ebbs, which is good news, but then you have turnaround time because the main laboratories have shifted their focus to areas of greater need at other parts of the country. So we have the 10 to 14 day turnaround time start to pop up again. Which brings me to the kind of innovation activities that the Mass General Brigham Center for COVID Innovation has been looking at since the end of February, roughly. And that has been an international effort, offered often as many as 400 people in any given meeting, looking at approaches for what tests actually work. It was the Wild West at the beginning of this, and what actually could be produced and work consistently. What samples and what tests can be done on platforms that don't have a supply chain problem. Even today, most of the clinical labs in our hospitals are looking at least at 2, sometimes 4 and 5 different platforms that they have to shift samples to based on the supply chain on any given day. So we're dealing with, and that's just a US problem in the middle of a very prolific biotech sector in this city. When you start moving outside of the city and then farther afield, some of the conversations we're having on a global front in countries that are landlocked in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they depend entirely on truck traffic to get supplies, critical materials into the country, and they need to test the drivers that are coming through. And there's really nothing for them to test. So they're doing as much as they can with the little they have available, and they're desperate for something that can help them manage the inflow of supplies into their country. And it's not just getting their economy back going, it's survival that they're talking about. So there's that sort of distribution challenge with the tests that are coming out, and they're looking for things that can be done much faster and in a lower resource area often. And some of those lower resource areas are right here in this country as well. So we're dealing with opening up the economy and how you establish what Massachusetts estimates may say we need about 500,000 tests a day. The largest of the centers that are doing the kind of testing in this state, at least, may be doing 100,000 plus a day. So we're still looking at fractions of what we need, and a distribution network that means that a lot of people would love to have samples tested, but have contracts with particular labs or labs that they know where to send it, and the turnaround time extends as people look at other parts of the country that need it more because of how hot the epidemic is there. So in terms of laboratory testing and our vantage point from a large academic medical center system, we still have problems with supply chains, and we still have problems with blocks of samples that are being sent to labs that don't get them back fast enough. So we still have challenges, but there's an enormous amount of innovation happening that we're seeing coming through the Center for COVID Innovation that are looking at very fast turnaround time, distributed level testing, but it's probably not going to be available until towards the end of this year or early part of next.
Thank you. And I think the compare contrast is really interesting, because we are innovating while the sports car is driving 100 miles an hour on the highway and we're trying to put the wheels on. And at the same time, we also have some very specific issues with our health systems that have been broken for a long time, and we're learning how to fix them. And we're also seeing, it's interesting because when you look at the news, there's all this issue on capacity and is there enough capacity, and there's not enough tests. And in fact, what's interesting is, especially in Massachusetts, there is enough testing. It's the logistics around where it is, how you access it, and how we knit it all together that has been, interesting and an issue. And it's playing itself out from a national perspective as well. And so I think this is a good segue to go to Sake, because you've managed, when you think about what you've done with the local biotechs, with Color, I'd love for you to talk about the testing initiative, because it is a bit of a microcosm of how you have been able to knit it together and continue to grow it as we move forward. So Sake, why don't you take it away and talk about that?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to MassBio for organizing this and the opportunity to contribute. So I lead Verve Therapeutics. So we're a local biotech. We're developing a gene editing medicine to treat heart attack. We have about 40 people, and our work, like many of the local biotechs, involves cells, mice, animal models, the kind of work that can't be done from home. So when the pandemic hit in March, there was really a key challenge, which is to how to provide a safe working environment for our employees. We initially focused on the usual things like social distancing, masks, hand hygiene, and a symptom-based questionnaire, which now is pretty routine around businesses. But it became clear quite quickly that about 40%, up to 40% of people who develop COVID are asymptomatic. So you're not going to catch them with a symptom-based questionnaire. And really the only way to catch these asymptomatic people before they enter the workplace and spread the infection is routine surveillance testing. So that was pretty clear to me and us in mid-March. And when we looked around in mid-March for infrastructure that would allow for this kind of routine surveillance testing, there was none. And so we ended up, a couple of biotech CEOs got together to really develop this infrastructure. And we partnered with Color Genomics and the Broad Institute to really put together a testing program. We piloted that. So it took about 6 weeks to put that program together. And then we piloted it from mid-May to end of June. And the pilot went very well. And then that led to a commercial product offering from Color starting July 1. And the results of that experience from July 1 to now, I'll describe. So we have about 51 local biotechs participating in this surveillance testing program. The collection site is 2 trailers, basically located in a parking lot outside of our building in Tech Square. And actually the trailers were provided kindly by Alexandra Real Estate, the company that owns the building. Most employers are screening each employee once a week. The employees basically walk in. They have a clinician there that swabs the front of their nose. Remember, they're all asymptomatic. It walks in front of the nose, and then basically walks out. It takes about 5 minutes or so. Now, the employees have actually scheduled themselves through an online platform that Color kind of has set up. So after the testing is done, the results come back and the employees are notified by text. Our median turnaround time for the test results has been 12 hours. And there are about 2,580 tests that have been done since the program went into production phase. And thankfully, all 2,580 tests have come back negative. And this program has given our employees, as well as the other employees of the 50 other companies, kind of tremendous peace of mind, knowing that every single person coming into the labs has been tested that week and has been negative. And as a result, as a direct result, we've been very productive and actually been able to maintain kind of or hit all our R&D milestones, including proof of concept data in non-human primates for our gene editing medicine that we released at the end of June. So that's been our experience. It's been a very good experience in terms of setting this up and having it work. But I think, as somebody else mentioned, this is a logistics problem. It's not a technology problem right now. We know what to do. It's actually getting people around the table to do it and do it in an organized fashion. And so I think our experience hopefully will be an example for others to kind of model after. Thank you.
Fantastic. And so, you know, as all of you think about your different programs and you think about all of the components that go into these programs, I think Greg can help us understand, what do we do with our people? So whether or not we're testing our people coming back into the office, whether or not we're setting up programs, there's a lot of questions. Also, interestingly enough, us in our business world, we might take more chances with ourselves, but we don't take them with our families, right? So, it's just a matter of, I'm fine to get on an airplane in a couple of months, but I don't want my children maybe to go back to school. So how does it all work? And when you're dealing with the people components of it, what, Greg, have you put into effect at the Broad and just in general that you've been seeing that really helps us understand what we should be thinking from a human resources perspective around COVID testing?
Sure. Thank you. So I think we're in a pretty unusual situation in the Broad, where we have institute members who run infectious disease labs. And so we immediately stood up a COVID task force in March. And we're sort of trying to be out in front of this, sort of assuming the worst, planning for the worst, and hoping for the best. And the worst came, so we were pretty well prepared. And so basically pulled together a task force and then a central planning task force so we could aggregate all the facilities, EHS, HR, IT to marshal the resources to think about emptying the building of all the non-COVID, non-super critical research. And we went down to about 200 scientists that actually maintained and stayed in the building. And then thinking about how do we, as we moved along with PPE regulations and thinking about now that we didn't have a density issue with only 200 people in the 4 different buildings. What do we do basically to ensure the safety? And we also, of course, stood up a testing program to try and put people at ease. One of the big challenges from an HR standpoint was people's reluctance to take public transportation, to how are they going to get into work. And we opened up all our parking so that they wouldn't have to worry about that. The people would traditionally have taken public transportation were able to drive in sort of as a way to ease their concern. We too partnered with Color Genomics to be the sort of aggregator of data and to manage the swabbing. We completely reconfigured our auditorium to the degree that we put hardwood down on top of the carpet to make sure that we were able to clean it efficiently. And I think we have a pretty aggressive testing protocol as a way to keep people more comfortable along with the PPE and the density planning. We stood up on 2 other teams, a testing team, and one of the really coolest innovative team as we thought about bringing the scientists, 900 or so, back into the organization and keeping them safe and trying to lower anxiety. We test everyone that's coming back in, we test every 4 days. So we have this rotation that takes place every 4 days, and it's been extremely successful. So from a people standpoint, our sort of take on it was, this is the safest place you can be because everyone's getting tested, everyone's maintaining a social distancing. We went through all the work of the facilities department and actually creating density mapping for the different labs so people know how many people could be at a bench if it was only one, how we managed the hallways, how we managed the elevators. And this was all sort of to make sure that people were, weren't if they were infectious and they weren't, distributing that or infecting other people. But really, it was more like a peace of mind piece. And that was really important from a leadership standpoint, that people feel comfortable and can get back to doing what they really love doing. And our administrative employees are not back. They're probably not going to be back until January. So I think the other piece to that is that we aggressively thought about how do we keep people engaged, how do we manage the anxiety when they're working from home. And honestly, we went into a great deal of work. Our Broad Life organization, we even created an agreement with Bright Horizons where we would test the teachers so that Brodies who need to get back into labs, whose work could only be done in labs, could drop off their kids, sign up for a drop off their kids, and they would be the parents would be tested, and the teachers would get tested by the Brode. We also, kicked off parenting during COVID workshops. We worked with infant, toddler, childcare briefings, coaching, peace at home parenting, support groups for parenting, both through our own and our KGA, our employee resource e-group. And then we also engaged mental health resources for through other organizations, Kendall Square, to provide additional support for the employees who are struggling, as everyone at this point understands, to manage kids being home and getting their work done and doing the kid handoff and I'll tell you one thing that's really interesting, that one of the sort of things that surprise a lot of people is that Zoom calls are horrible. We can sort of agree that that's really, when you do them, from 8 in the morning till 6 at night. But I've gotten feedback that people are more vulnerable in a way because you see their life behind them. And so people are connecting differently because of Zoom calls, and it's sort of counterintuitive in some ways, but people that you might work with in a lab, now you're seeing them at their home with their cat walking across their computer, or their kids coming in and asking questions, and all of a sudden we've got this connection that we really didn't have before. And so that was really an interesting learning, I think, in this process. So I think we ramped back 900 people into the scientists into the lab. And one of the other things that we did, we created quarterbacks for the labs. And it's a kind of a goofy sports analogy, but the quarterback, a designated person for each lab that would work with facilities for density planning, and they would be the focus for people who needed to get back in. And how do we manage that from a lab standpoint? How do we manage the social distancing, and how do we manage density? And so that was really a pretty innovative approach to trying to ramp back up so that people would remain feel safe and remain committed and dedicated to getting back in and doing the science.
That's great, thank you. It's been interesting as we've watched this unravel over the last months. I think it was a commentator that said, we have a pandemic health crisis on our hands, but we also have a looming mental health crisis on our hands. And whether or not, we just have a little bit of stage fright being on camera all day long, or if it really is, the opening up of there are no boundaries anymore. We always joke about how there's the work life, and work life is kind of integrated in, but now there's nothing like that. And I think that I love all the programs that you talked about, and I think that there can't be enough underscoring behind that mental health component. And it leads us to our last one. So as we take a step back and look at all of our panelists today, and then we turn our attention to what Jessica is going to talk about, it's not only in our biotech community, it is across our nation of some of these programs. And as I mentioned before, you're thinking not only about your worker safety, but you're thinking about your family safety. You're thinking about the players on the court that we would love entertainment on, and we need to get them back. And we are getting them back in and playing. But it's also thinking about just our overall fabric of our society. And in each group that we work with has a different set of challenges, and a different set of logistics, and a different set of ability to spend money on testing. And so Jessica, I'm gonna turn it over to you for you to talk about KPMG's role in working through this, and some of the things that you've seen as you've worked with the innovators and the aggregators and the health systems and the franchises to meet different needs.
Thanks, Kristen. So most of my work at KPMG, even before COVID, was in diagnostic strategy. I start with that because when I say that I work at KPMG, I still get people who assume that I work in accounting or audit, but luckily for all of us, I'm not here to talk about accounting today. I couldn't do that even if I wanted to. We have a very strong advisory practice at KPMG, and my role has always been to help life sciences companies with their diagnostics, pharma, and other life sciences strategy. So when COVID-19 hit, we leveraged our diagnostic strategy expertise to help labs to scale up and ramp up their COVID-19 testing to hundreds of thousands of tests per day. We also helped our other clients like employers and universities and government agencies and the sports teams that Kristen mentioned, like the NBA, who needed a COVID-19 testing strategy to keep their people safe. So when we talk to those employers and universities and others, I think everyone agrees that there is so much information available on COVID, but that information is constantly evolving and the sources conflict with each other. So I see my role at Kpmg as helping employers and universities and other groups sort through all of that info and to help them understand if they need COVID-19 testing as part of their reopening plans, why they should do COVID testing, who to test, how to test, where to test, and when to test based on the best available information that we have. So when we're working with labs, I think the biggest challenge is setting up all the infrastructure and logistics, which Sek was alluding to. We were working with a lab that was conducting COVID testing for one of the biggest cities in the United States, and there was a website set up so that people could schedule their COVID tests, but almost 20% of people in that major cosmopolitan city didn't have access to internet or smartphones. So we had to set up a telephone hotline and do it old school where thousands of people could call in and make an appointment for COVID testing. So that's one example of the infrastructure. But if you think about just before COVID, we were doing all those diagnostic tests, but we weren't testing millions of people at mobile pop-up sites or via drive-through testing. So for any of you who have gone to a mobile testing site, like a drive-through to do your testing, that mobile testing site probably didn't exist a few days before you arrived. Someone took an empty building or an empty parking lot or an empty trailer and turned it into a COVID-19 collection site, including all the operations, procurement, IT, and HR infrastructure that surrounded it. So just thinking about HR, we're helping labs find the people to collect samples, bring samples to the lab, process the samples, and run the test in the lab. It's all the things that surround COVID testing that people aren't thinking about that can be challenging, but it's getting easier and easier to work through as we keep doing this across America, keep developing our playbooks and learning best practices.
Thank you. Okay, and so that is our panel, and these are our points of view. And I think that as I watched the questions come through, what's great is that each one of you that asked the questions are asking an additional question, that something that hasn't been covered before, or something that we really need to work through. And so as I look at this, one of the first areas that I do want to make sure that we double click on is we talk about all this innovation, but we're talking about testing as though it's one thing, right? And at the end of the day, we still have viral, we have antibody, we have antigen testing, we've got point of care, we've got in the lab, and we've got these different components. And so the big question that is coming in from the audience is saying, what is the need for antibody testing at this point? When we think about it from a Massachusetts perspective, why would we do this now? And who would do it? And what do we want to think about in the future? So, Sek, I'm going to start with you because you nodded your head first. And I'm going to have you start, and then I'll have one of our other panelists add to that so that we can tell the audience a little bit about what your feeling is on some of these techniques that might not have been front running in the beginning.
Yeah, so I have a very short answer to the antibody question. There's no role for antibody testing right now. Essentially no role. And the reason is, it's very simple. We have no idea what a positive test means. And so we don't know if that means immunity, and if so, for how long. So it's really a curiosity, and people want to know that whether they've been infected or not. There's value in serologic surveys across the country, for example, to figure out what the infection rate has been. But at an individual level, there's actually very little value, at least certainly for our company, for our employees. So we have not done any antibody testing. There is value, as I said, for testing for acute viral infection. Is the person infected with the virus at the moment you are seeing them? And there, we had two choices when we started. One is, PCR-based test to look for virus. The other is an antigen test to look for virus. Both of those kind of things are available right now. The antigen test just came online, at least a few different vendors. The PCR test was the first to come online, and that's what we've settled on for our testing right now through the Broad and Color. And that really is the gold standard, highest sensitivity, highest specificity, but also the most challenging in terms of logistics, all the items that have to go into the testing. But it is, available, as I said, and given that it was the gold standard, that's what we settled on. I can see us actually moving in the near future, in the next few months, to an antigen test. And the advantage of antigen tests is cheaper. So right now, our test that we're for each employee, it's $80 a test. The antigen tests could be as little as $20, $25 a test. So that's one main advantage. And the other is time. The antigen tests typically they can be point of care. So it could be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, you get the result back, as opposed to 12 hours, 14 hours that we're getting right now.
Great. And how does everybody feel about pooled testing? Who wants to answer that one?
Well, I think pool testing for many of our communities is a topic of very vigorous discussion right now. There's a question in the Q&A about that for schools.
Yes.
The question then becomes the sensitivity of the assay and how fast you can get the answer back. I agree with Sek on the antigen tests. There's some pros and cons to that, but repeatedly the biggest challenge has been the sensitivity for the antigen test. But on repeated tests of the same individual, you start to build up a pattern and you can increase that sensitivity. So it has its uses as a point of service, at least, if not point of care. The pooled approaches are going to be very interesting if you know what you're going to do with an answer. And at the current prevalence rate, we're fine. If the prevalence rate goes up, then pooled is going to be a problem again. But the thing that I've consistently not heard in many of the approaches around pool testing is what you do when you get a positive answer. Do you break out the pool and sequester those folks in the pool for a few days? Is it in a school system? Are you sending everybody home until you can test everyone? What's the logistics after that? Because as we've talked about before, the biggest challenge here is often not the technology, it's the logistics surrounding the technology. I actually think that approaches that Sherlock is doing, the antigen tests, some of the very rapid, on the order of minutes, PCR-based amplification techniques in the variety of flavors that are available nowadays are likely to push past the need to do pooling. And it'll be mainly a supply chain issue that will drive the pooling if it occurs in particular environments or not. It's going to be a very mixed bag around the country and I think around the world for quite a bit. Right now, we're hearing in parts of the world in East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, that the antibody test is the only thing that they have available. So they're going to do the study and they don't really care about whether you're immune or not. They're using it as a avatar for exposure.
Yes.
And just to get some sense of what's going on there, because right now they had been, for a variety of other infectious disease reasons, relying on things like the Gene Expert platform, but supply chain is really challenging for a number of the proprietary platforms that are out there. So it's going to be a mixed bag around the world.
What we have seen is exactly the same. It is from an international perspective, the cost of some of the PCR testing is prohibitive. And so the antibody testing is the only thing. I think the question also becomes too, once a vaccine or vaccines become available, one of the key highlights that we have been exposed to is whether or not antibody testing can be used to screen people into a category that you either get the vaccine earlier or you don't get the vaccine at all. So any thoughts or debate on that issue, which will be coming like a freight train coming through in the fall and in the winter?
I think I said earlier, I think the key unknown for the antibody test, for any given antibody test, is how long is the protective immunity. And the only way to get that is with a cohort study where you have a bunch of people you bring in, you do the testing, and then you follow them over time to see for those who do turn out positive and have an antibodies, what is their risk of reinfection? And that data you're not going to know for like a year from now. And so without that data, in my mind, it'd be very hard to withhold vaccine, for example, from somebody if you just simply can't say what the clinical meaning is of a positive antibody test.
Greg, there's a question that came in on mandatory testing for your employees at the Broad. It also begs the question of what do we make mandatory for testing and what do we not? And so I would love to understand how the answer to the question, and then also how you think about it as you think about this from an HR functionality perspective.
Well, we certainly do make testing mandatory for anyone that wants to be in any of the labs or any of the buildings. And I think we haven't really come across someone saying, I refuse to get tested. We've had people say that I'm really just not comfortable coming in to do work. And so we sort of take those on a one-off basis, working with our HR business partners and managers to find to what degree people can do remote work if they're lab-based. We've been very flexible around those kinds of challenges. Our perspective is that if people want to come in the lab, they are required to get tested, and it's a bona fide occupational qualification at this point. And a lot of the the new legal regulations around from like the EEOC is very much supports the CDC guidance around testing and around COVID. So there's more flexibility than there traditionally has been, given the risk of infecting other people. But we have been we sort of take it on a one-off basis and try to work through, and we also try to determine if there's a health issue that, putting aside someone who is immunocompromised in the family, but if the individual is struggling and maybe having undue fears, how do we think about that as a health issue, and how do we help facilitate keeping them safe and not having them get triggered by coming in? So we've been pretty flexible and taking it case by case.
One aspect of Kristen, when we looked at the legal aspect, is the less invasive the test is during the pandemic, the risk-benefit calculus is a little different. And so one of the concerns expressed by our employees up front was they were not that comfortable with the deep nasopharyngeal swab on a weekly basis. And so we ended up evaluating the literature and found that the anterior nares, which is just the front of the nose, sampling is basically nearly as good as the deep nasopharyngeal swab. And so we settled on that as the sampling, and that actually is more comfortable and probably a little easier to accept in general.
Good, that's great. And I'm actually going to have Jessica answer a question on mandatory employer screening and such, because we have some additional data on that. And then Raul, I'm going to have you answer a question on the differences between the saliva and the nasal swabs and all of that, because you've just been so deep in understanding some of these. So I'll go to Jessica first, and then I'll go to Raul. But Jessica, go ahead on the mandatoriness.
So with regards to the mandatory test, it depends on which test we're talking about. If we're talking about testing to see whether an employee currently has COVID-19, to Greg's point, you can require that. The rationale is that if they have COVID and they come into the office, they can pose a direct threat to the health of others, and that's why you can mandate that. But under the ADA, you cannot require an antibody test for the reasons that we talked about earlier, because there's not, direct result of, you can't say that that person is immune or anything like that from just an antibody test.
And that's a question we get a lot. When people are setting up these programs, they're also thinking about the pricing and the ballooning of test costs and adding in all of these programs of what's actually legal, what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. So it's been an interesting process. And so now to go to our last question, it really does go back to that saliva versus swabs, thinking about, will there be something, one of the audience panelists said, could there be a pregnancy test where basically you get up in the morning, you take it every day, and then you know whether or not you're ready to go to work. So Raul, I'd love you to answer some of those questions as you think of about this next frontier that we're moving into.
Yeah, the nice thing has been, we've been accumulating a lot of data around a lot of sample types since the pandemic arose. And we've been seeing a lot more data demonstrating that saliva actually is a viable source. I think that we have to be aware that sensitivity of whatever interrogation method has to be adequate to identify the presence of some virus in whatever sample we take. And it's denser in the nasopharyngeal swab than it is in saliva. But saliva can be accumulated at higher volumes, which makes it something that can be used. And so the good news is that the good news about all the bad news is that there is enough viral load in the patients who are asymptomatic, certainly in the symptomatic patients, that it can be extracted from saliva. And so in terms of technology development, there is, as we think about the different ways and the different targets you have, antigen, antibody, and molecular, antigen, the two that you could use for identifying the presence of a virus in saliva are either antigen tests or molecular. And so if we think about the opportunity to have something that is pregnancy test-like in the home, it would have to fall into one of those two categories. And I think for it to be viable for use, it would need to be highly sensitive so as to remove doubt about the result, or studied well enough that the sequential use of that result, if not perfectly sensitive, could be interpreted in a way that allows us to make decisions. So we may have a lower sensitivity test that we use more than once that gets us to the right answer, but that doesn't work unless the price point is appropriate. And so I think that is the right question. Can we get to something that is simple enough, sensitive enough, and cost effective enough to be used in the home? And generally that becomes an antigen question. I think the thing that's exciting within Sherlock is that we actually have a molecular version of that, where we can actually directly interrogate for the RNA within saliva that can be administered on a lateral flow or dipstick test, like a pregnancy test. And that is what's in development that we feel will help satisfy that third rung of the testing after we do central lab, point of care, and then finally at home, nursing homes, and other areas that you don't necessarily have somebody to administer the test. So the nice thing about this is innovation is accelerating around this. This is a target Sherlock was always on, something we're always going to develop. I think what we're seeing is a lot of activity around antigen testing. I think what we hope for there is that we're raising enough antibodies that are sensitive enough that we can actually say that we're achieving PCR sensitivity. And there's good work being done there. And then on the molecular side, we're very excited at Sherlock that we believe sometime first half of next year, we will have something that is lab quality in the palm of your hand.
That's great. Good. And so in final sum, as we look at this, Glenn, as you look at this and you think of, how long we've been working through this space in diagnostics and how long it's taken to get some of this innovation to this point, but yet we've made such strides in the last 4 or 5 months in lightning speed. What do you think is going to be that breaking point of our systems to be able to only get so fast, so far? Are we there now? Are we at the limit of our able to innovate this fast? Do we still have more to go? What do you think is the final challenge to get to that frontier where we're able to churn and burn like this for the rest of our existence?
Well, I mean, it breaks into 2 points specific to COVID. We're seeing technologies come through the Innovation Center that provide a result in a matter of seconds. So there's still some room to go on this. That's a technical turnaround time, not a physical sample provision to result turnaround time, but you expand that and it's on a matter of minutes. Not all those are going to be home tests, but they could be at the front door kind of tests. So I think there's innovation that is coming, and we're probably not at the limit of that innovation. They're looking at actually doing things like you do in the TSA for bomb sniffing in entire centers and seeing if there's COVID in the air. So there are tests coming along those lines, and people are pushing the envelope very hard in these days. I think the second part of your question, though, is the environment of innovation. And in the early days, and end of February through March and April, as I mentioned at the outset, the innovation center that MGB stood up had 1,000 people on Zoom meetings working together. Intellectual property was not an issue. People were just throwing ideas in there and seeing what would actually stick to the wall. As we started getting farther and farther into this, and you need to have real productivity, real products shipped, and distribution and logistics, the groups got smaller and smaller and smaller, and people started to split out into what is a more normal innovation effort, by which I mean it's a bit more fragmented, and people are looking at what's the commercial rationale for doing this. I think we're going to settle somewhere in the middle on this, where there will be people that will devote and make changes and decisions they wouldn't have made pre-COVID, but now in a COVID world and a pre-vaccine controlled world, we're probably going to see developments come out that make sense, and people will be willing to make decisions for the better good. I think overall, though, the challenge for many companies putting innovations out there is, I have a great innovation, who's willing to buy it? And without the ability to say, I have a block of samples that can be tested right now with your device, or I have a way to get that device paid for, we're not too far from where we were pre-COVID. And that's a challenge. That's the thing that I think we all need to get over, and maybe make some systemic changes that enable blocks of samples to be guaranteed for particular commercial entities, with controls around turnaround time and quality, that gives an investment decision a backing to be made for a particular company to produce a particular device.
Right. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. Special thanks to MassBio for putting on this panel and getting us all together and pushed through. Special thanks to these panelists. I think it is incredible to hear from such various perspectives that are all working together to fight this and to keep on continuing to move forward, not only from a COVID perspective, but also from an overall innovation and health systems perspective. And I think that this balanced view today, we hope you enjoyed it, and definitely reach out for more questions. This has been recorded, so you can replay parts of it if you want to hear specific areas again. And we hope that you all have a good day and stay very safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel. Have a good day.
Thank you.